Greetings and welcome back to the podcast. This episode, we are joined by Mr. Dick Brown, President and CEO of Kathairos, a methane reduction company based in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. Kathairos technology is used by more than 55 major oil and gas producers in 17 North American shale basins and is on track to generate approximately $50 million in revenues by year end. Since inception, Kathairos has mitigated approximately 185,000 metric tons of CO2 emissions, the equivalent of about 3 million trees. Mr. Dick Brown holds a Bachelor of Science degree in engineering from the University of Alberta and is a professional engineer designation holder. Among other things, we discussed the business case for methane reduction, how Kathairos has mitigated approximately 185,000 tons of CO2, and how energy producers can benefit. Enjoy. This podcast episode is sponsored by Enverus. Enverus is the world's largest energy-dedicated software-as-a-service company committed to helping customers close the gap between data and value creation. Enverus has been supporting the Canadian energy industry for over 30 years. Visit Enverus.com for more details. This episode is brought to you by Upgrade Labs. Upgrade Labs offers a comprehensive range of cutting-edge performance and recovery services that have been proven to optimize your health in minutes, not hours. Whether it's accelerating muscle mass and bone density or addressing injury and inflammation, start your experience by booking a free cell health analysis at upgradelabs.com/Calgary. This podcast is brought to you by Energy United. Energy United is an organization with a mission to promote practical energy policy across Canada. Energy United is building a community of Canadians that are passionate about Canada's natural gas and oil industry and are willing to take action. Energy United is driving change on issues that matter, all the way from the carbon tax to the emissions cap. Join Energy United to make a difference at energyunited.ca. Well, if you're ready, we can begin.
Sure. Sounds great.
Good morning, Mr. Dick Brown. Thank you very much for doing this. I really appreciate your time.
Nice to meet you, Trevor.
For the listener, you are the CEO of Kathairos Solutions.
That's right.
What is Kathairos Solutions?
Kathairos Solutions is a energy services environmental technology company. So we're here to help support the industry in addressing their methane emissions, particularly through pneumatic devices.
In simple terms, you help the oil and gas producer reduce methane emissions at the well site, if I'm correct?
Yeah. So I'll tell you a little story about pneumatics and give you a little more clarity. Back in 1859, when Drake drilled the first oil well in Titusville, Pennsylvania, and they learned then that they needed to control the flow. And so it was literally 9 years later in the 1860s that pneumatic devices in the energy industry came to be. And so what these are is they're simple valves and such that use the pressure of gas to open and close because you don't have power at a lot of these sites. And so it was a very, very simple thing for the industry to do, and it made an enormous amount of sense. You just use the pressure of the natural gas at the well site to control the flow of oil, gas, and water from the well. So it's been going on for over 150 years, but since it was such a simple way of controlling wells, it became pretty much everywhere that the industry existed. And so every one of these well sites is controlled. What the procedure right now is to use the natural gas from the wellhead. It allows for a pressure that can actuate a valve. The valve opens and then a spring closes it. And every time that happens, a small amount of methane is eliminated into the atmosphere. So this was never a big deal until it was recognized a decade ago that methane was really bad for the environment. I always say it probably would never have happened if you could smell methane or see it. But because you can't, it's become widely used. And so really just addressing these because we want to eliminate the methane. And in an individual well basis, it's not a big deal. It might be 100 to 200 tons of CO2 in a year. But In the US, there's over 500,000 locations doing it. In Canada, there's over 150,000 locations doing it. It's 39% of all the methane that's emitted in the energy industry, and it's controllable. So trying to deal with that, coming up with solutions to be able to address that has been a big deal for the industry because it's something they want to do. But now there's regulations that say they must do it. And that's all happening over a 5-year period. So just get in your mind the massive project management exercise that's about to happen in the industry to address these 500,000 plus locations. Let's put the plans together, right?
Just so I understand it correctly, how does that work with the methane you injected in it?
So the well site itself has a separator on it. All the oil, gas, water go into this separator. And that's what it does. It separates out the oil, the water. Water goes down to disposal wells. The oil goes to market. The gas goes to a gas plant. And so every time that separator fills, it needs to be told it's time to get rid of the water or the oil, right? Or release pressure to move more gas. So what's doing that? They don't have electricity on site. So what they do is they use the pressure from the natural gas that's in the separator, and that runs a system. Because of the pressure, there will be a lever, a controller that says oil needs to be let out of the separator. So there's a controller that sends a message, a gas message, to a valve saying pressure up. So that gas pressure now goes to push the valve open. And then that controller says, okay, it's empty. You can close. And so it takes the pressure off and the valve spring closes the valve again. But where does that gas go? That gas goes to the environment. So all we do is that line where it came off the gas of the separator, we tie into that. We put a valve on so they shut off the gas that was doing this, the methane. And now the nitrogen just takes over all of it. Really simple.
So instead of using excess gas to complete the process, you use nitrogen. So there's no
so now the nitrogen gas goes back to the atmosphere, which is where it first came from, right? Nitrogen is taken from air and dropped to 196 to get it to liquefy.
I see.
And then we truck it and move it in liquid form.
And nitrogen doesn't harm the atmosphere?
It is air.
I see.
Right? 78% of our air is nitrogen.
So instead of using gas to complete the separation process, you're using nitrogen, long story short. I see.
And now that we're working with Kinder Morgan and a bunch of the midstreamers and compressor companies in the US, and they're now using it for starting compressors too. Like once this is on site, operators are going, wow, can we do this? And so they do, and they realize that it's really covering a lot of their methane issues because compressors used to be or are started with the same natural gas process, taking high pressure gas to turn a crank and releasing the gas into the atmosphere.
How does Kathairos make money?
We make money through our rental model by charging customers on a monthly basis for the tank rental and for what they actually consume for nitrogen. So we have a nitrogen price in every geography, and based on what the plant gate pricing is where we buy it, and then the distributed cost, they pay us for every location. We have telemetry that's on the tanks. It's a direct correlation because it's a closed loop. So we know for every standard cubic meter of gas, nitrogen gas we use, we've eliminated 1.2764 standard cubic meters of methane. So we collect that data every hour, download it twice a day to a platform. Then we use that data to tell us when we should fill up the tank. It also tells the operators, who have this app, which tells them everything that's going on at their site and how much emissions they're mitigating and that, but what their consumption is. If anything changes on site, we'll know it first because our data will tell us, it will send a flag saying something's going on at this site. But over the course of 2,000 locations and tens of thousands of wells now, we have the most empirical data in the industry on methane emissions, way better than anything that you can see through satellites or measurement through monitoring or things like that. we know exactly what these sites were doing. And so that's become very valuable data. I mean, it's good for the operators too. I mean, we've had some pretty crazy things happen where we've notified operators who've had lightning strikes on their facilities that have taken them down. We had one a couple weeks ago where we got like this red alert at 10 o'clock. We called the operators that something serious is going on with your facilities. And they sent an operator out, and a landslide had taken out the entire pad. So it was sitting down the road and our tank was kind of floating in the mud, sending data to us. But, so we make money by this rental model. It's I'm from the oil patch. I'm well heeled in the oil patch, and I know you have to drive to the bottom dollar because it will get there eventually. So I wanted to make it as economic as possible for customers while still getting a return for us and our shareholders. And yeah.
To go back in time a little bit, how'd you get into the energy industry and why?
Well, I graduated high school here in Calgary, and then I went to Western University for a couple of years and studied contemporary English and modern European history. Though I enjoyed it a lot and was doing well at it, I was young and realized I really needed to find something that was going to
pay the bill.
Pay a bill, yeah. And so I moved back west, and there's a guy, Bob Davidson, who was one of the owners of S&T Drilling. He gave me a job first building this Rig 7. And then once it was built, I went to the field with it and worked for 2 years on drilling rigs. And I loved it. I just loved the environment. It was really tough work, long hours, but the real satisfaction in completing these wells, getting them drilled. And so then I decided I should go to university. U of A was one of 2 universities that had petroleum engineering. So I went there, and then from there I started working with Amoco Canada Petroleum Company Limited, along with Bob Chason and Jim Saunders and, Phil Taves, a big group of guys who've all done very well in the industry here.
So then you kind of worked your way through the industry through the years, and
yeah.
What did you do after that?
I had some pretty crazy times at Amoco. I worked in Edmonton, and then I took care of a lot of properties in northern Alberta. I always had this belief that I was going to do something on my own. And then in 1987, Canada's largest business transaction at the time, which is where I met Hal Quisley, was when Amoco bought Dome Petroleum. And Dome Petroleum Canadians had a love affair with the company because it was entrepreneurial, aggressive, what they thought was owned and developed in Canada. Turns out a lot of the shareholders were American, but it was a $5.3 billion transaction. And so I was in my little inside office over here on 7th Avenue, and some guys came down from the 10th floor, which was a C-suite level, and said, "You got to come with us." And I didn't know if I was getting laid off or what was going on. And so I got called into the president's office then, T. Don Stacy, and he said, "There's a group of us, 12 in particular, who are putting together a transaction to complete to buy Dome Petroleum." And then I became kind of like his bag boy. For the next 2 years, I worked with him to be the go-between between Chicago, who made a lot of the decisions, and Don Stacy. And then I spoke on behalf of the company for any public releases or stuff. So nothing really engineering. And then I thought at that time that I really wanted to get back into the engineering world. And so I did. After that transaction was closed, Don Stacy basically said, "What job do you want? You can go anywhere." And so I wanted to go back to Edmonton. I was a big Oilers fan, still am. And then, I worked there in engineering supervision for a while, and then there for a year, and then got transferred back to Calgary to run a projects team with a bunch of geologists, geophysicists, and engineers. And then it was all getting pretty bureaucratic. So I thought, I need to find something that's small and entrepreneurial. And so I went and joined a company called Solex. And Solex has some very, very creative individuals running it. Ian McGregor, who you probably know, Rick Sukovich, Kevin J. Bush, I worked with directly and for there. And so I remember how different things were. Like I showed up there in the first week. I had an issue with my computer. So I'm asking Kevin about, who do we use? He says, oh, it's no problem. We have a little toolbox in the cupboard over there. Just go get it. And so it's kind of figure things out as you go. But that company, we spent about $12 million buying properties and developing them. And then literally within the year, sold them for over $90 million. So I know Rick and Ian did very well with that. Kevin as well. Then after that sold, I went and worked for a company called Hardy Oil and Gas. It was a British company that was, starting in Canada and all exploration, all drilling. But I met my first business partner there. So that sold in a couple of years. They sold it corporately. So all their assets across the globe, including all the Canadian stuff. But there was a fellow there, Randy Banks, who was, turned out to be a very good friend, an incredibly smart geologist. And so after that, we started a company called Strega, and we had trouble getting financing. So we went cold calling in New York, and we got Brian Lawrence, who's just a gem of a man, was so impressed that we came knocking on his door rather than the other way around, that he funded us. He got us out of that do loop, which is you're trying to buy properties and develop. Bob Chason talked a lot on your podcast about how to do that. But you have an initial problem in that you can't get the money if you don't have the property, and you can't secure the property if you don't have the money. So Brian Lawrence with Yorktown Partners took me out of that situation where they provided the financing based on whatever we were able to secure. So we got these assets, got them going, started developing them. And then unfortunately, I was with Randy and his close friend, and he had a car accident and was killed one Friday night. So that really turned things on its head. A lot of introspection. I mean, there's a lot of soul searching in events like this. But I carried on with Strega and sold to Renaissance. So you probably know the story of Renaissance back in the day. They were prolific drillers and buyers, and that all turned out well. Then I started a company called Invasion Energy, which was kind of interesting. It was funded by Enron. So this is back before the Enron implosion. We bought a whole bunch of assets in the Haro-Boyer region. We bought them for $27 million. $23 million of it was Enron debt, and $4 million of it was equity. So then I continued to develop and work on it. And after about 2 years, we sold it to the Weiser Oil Company out of Dallas for $56 million. So it was a pretty good turn back in that day. But during that time, so we sold it literally 6 months before Enron imploded also. But during that time, I got to know Kyle Kitagawa, Ian Dundas, and a few guys who you'd probably be familiar with. And one of the things I recognized during that time was the energy industry really struggled to get liquid CO2 for fracking for all these shallow gas locations. And so I kind of dug in, tried to figure out why that was happening. And I realized that all of the CO2 that was used in liquid form came from a Air Liquide plant in Medicine Hat. And so whenever there was a shortage, the food industry would eat first. So there were regular shortages of liquid CO2. And so the industry was always starved on this. And so wells were getting delayed, and it was a real problem. So I thought, well, it would make sense to build out a liquid CO2 infrastructure for the industry. So I went about doing this, secured all the CO2 sources that had acceptable levels of CO2 concentration across the province, up in the north in Elmworth and Rimbey and north of Medicine Hat. And then I thought, well, this is great. These plants are not that complicated. So Toromont was a company who are now Enerflex. They built these liquid CO2 facilities. So I went about securing a plant for our first location, which was in Rimbey with Keyera. And then I went trying to finance it. So I had half the plant built. It was about $7 million additional cost to the plant, and then tried to finance it. And so, yeah, I talked to Brett Wilson and that group, and not a lot of traction. I didn't know then what I know now about private equity and all the other sources of capital, but I just couldn't get financing. It took 2 years. And then in 2003, there was a gentleman who I have a ton of respect for, Clay Riddell. I went to him. I knew him personally and said to him one Friday morning, I said, I have this business plan and it's not getting any traction. And, Clay could have paid for everything himself. And I said, but I don't want your money. What I would like is for you to tell me what's wrong with the business plan. And I said, I'm meeting Hank Swart out on Monday. So, if you have any suggestions, it'd be great to get those on the table. And Clay called me Sunday night and said, Dick, I talked it over with the family and we love this. This is something we would do. Mm-hmm. He said, I'm willing to finance. And he says, but let me know how you make out with Hank. And so that morning was kind of fun because Monday morning, and I'd heard so much about Hank Swart out, and he's kind of the energy industry equivalent of Donald Trump. And I remember it was 5 to 9. I was going up the elevator of the Petro-Canada building then, and 42nd floor. I get off. I'm ushered into his office. I sit at a table in front of him, and he says, what do you want? And I said, well, I'd like to go through this business plan. And he looks at me kind of strange and says, yeah, what do you want? And so I open up the business plan, start flipping through it, and he puts his hand on it and says, what do you want? When I realized he was asking how much money I wanted. So I said, well, I need $7 million to finish the first plan. He says, okay, he starts pulling out a check. I'm like, okay. I said, well, there's somebody else involved. And he said, who? I said, well, Clay Riddell, I talked to him last night and he's interested in investing. So Hank said, okay, tell Clay we'll go 50-50 on this. No, I'll call Clay and tell him. Then he writes me out a check. And then I go back to the office and it's literally, I'm going down the elevator. It's 5 after 9. So in 10 minutes, after 2 years of searching, I have a $3.5 million check in my hand. And when I get to the office, I have a draft from Clay Riddell for $3.5 million. Those two guys are now shareholders of the company. Everybody wants to be a shareholder in the company, right? They had such great success. And that's when First Energy got involved. And, one of my first lessons about dilution, because we just blew our brains out, spent a lot of money developing the largest cryogenic infrastructure in Western Canada, had Calfrac at the time. Trican was working with us, Sangel, some great companies. And one of the problems with this was coal bed methane days, and they completed with nitrogen. And I remember Hank joined me at this meeting with the Calfrac C-suite, Doug Ramsey in particular. And Doug was, if we buy CO2 from you, Air Liquide's going to cut us off from nitrogen. So we need you to make nitrogen too. So then I learned about liquid nitrogen, which is a cryogenic liquid. So, liquid nitrogen is minus 196. It's cold stuff. And so we built out 3 CO2 plants and 2 nitrogen plants within the first year and a half. It was fun. The first opening was at Rimbey with Keyera, and it was opened by Peter Lougheed, who was the chairman of Keyera at the time. So my mother certainly liked that. I think she had a bit of a crush on him. But yeah, it was, pretty heady days. And then after in 2008, so we raised all this money at $1 and then sold the company at $4 to a private equity firm. And things were going pretty good with a private equity firm. I stayed in to help run it. And then things started going south in the industry, with gas prices tanking. So we had liquid nitrogen, liquid CO2, but the liquid nitrogen was a cryogenic, as is LNG. And I saw an opening for a space to be able to get into the LNG space on small scale approach. So built out a couple facilities, built a LNG plant in Elmworth. It trucked LNG up to the Yukon for their power grid. It was originally designed for fracking or for pumping equipment and such, to replace diesel. Then built the world's first deep water LNG bunkering facility for fueling ocean-going ships, which are quickly converting to LNG. And so we built a fit-for-purpose facility in Jacksonville, Florida, with the Coast Guard there, and then built a small scale LNG plant, and then started developing LNG into the Caribbean. So that was all going well until 2020. The entity in Canada for liquid nitrogen, liquid CO2 was really struggling because of the downturn in the industry. So if you remember what was happening with Trican stock and Calfrac stock during that day, it was really rough. And then we were owned basically by a private equity firm out of Houston. And they told me, I want you going back to working 100% on the Canadian entity. We need to fix this. The reduced cash flow that it was kicking out. How do you change an industry, that was struggling? The services industry was in horrible shape. And so got in a pretty serious fight with the private equity firm, then left Ferris in June of 2020. And then it was August where there was one of the engineers that worked for me at Ferris and helped build out the LNG space with me, Jason Clark, came and said, I have this idea for pneumatic devices and we know it's a problem. What do you think? And so I said, well, it certainly is simple. And then went to build some prototypes. So calling on friends, like Andy Purnell, who runs Strad, I said, can we get some space in Nisku? We bought a couple nitrogen tanks out of Bruce. We took them to Andy's yard in Nisku, and then we basically built the plumbing around this tank to be able to deliver pressured nitrogen gas from liquid form. And that pressured gas now could be used to drive pneumatic devices instead of the methane gas that the industry has been using, across the industry for 150 years. So we built out these two tanks. One of the company called Velvet Energy, who then became Suede, and now I'm not sure what they're going to do next. They've had incredible success in the last few years. One of my nephews was a vice president there. I said, run this past your engineers and see what they think. And they thought, oh, this is really interesting. Let's try it out. We're trying out air systems to address this problem. Let's try this. So we put these two tanks on, trial tanks, had PTAC supported, and then turned them on. Everybody's waiting around. There was this 3-well pad, one new greenfield well, just getting flush production in 2 brownfield locations, and turned it on and basically nothing happened. The nitrogen gas just took over all the work that the methane was doing, and it was a very simple tie-in. And then once a month we filled it up. We ran it through the winter, ran flawlessly. So we had support then. Like I was looking for support, not so much for financial purposes, but for exposure, in this industry. And then PTAC, through one of their networks, supported the original costs on the trial. So PTAC gave us exposure. Alberta is a hotbed for new technologies and development. It's really solid here. Unfortunately, they don't adopt as fast as the US, which is a different issue. But we ran the trial for a year. Velvet sold. So we were left there with all this data. We thought, when that trial ended, I thought, these tanks are going to be ubiquitous. And at that same time, Jill Evanko, who is the CEO of Chart Industries. It's a $7 billion company, heavy into hydrogen, nitrogen, anything cryogenic, the world's largest manufacturer of brazed aluminum heat exchangers. And it's a $7 billion company. But she called me because we had done a lot of work in the past on LNG. And she said, whatever you do next, call me. Let me know if you need R&D, if you need money, if you need people, any way we can support you, we will. So I said a few months later, funny that you say this because we need to go commercial with these small scale liquid nitrogen tanks. All we needed was a customer to get started. And I really believed in the technology. It is without question the most simple, inexpensive solution for a massive problem. But getting movement was hard. We went to NGIF again. They had a call for funding, tried to get funding that with them to scale. And there was one guy on the committee, we got a long ways with them, and then he basically rejected it and said, I don't get the business case behind this. How's it actually going to work? And, we tried explaining it all, but we got nowhere. And this was now beginning of August 2021. And that was really depressing. They had funded companies like WestGen at the time, Converge, they've renamed to, who did power generation on site with an air compressor and inverter boards and dryers and such and battery packs to address the same problem. So maybe they had already picked a winner. I don't know, but it was pretty deflating, but I kept with it. And Jacqueline, Jacqueline Peterson, who is now, I would consider a leader in this space. She actually won the top 40 under 40 last year in Calgary too for the work she's done in this space. But she had made an application to the EPA to get a spot in their virtual open house. Because remember, this is COVID times now. And she got a spot. And so she put together a little video of what we do. So that was right after this loss with NGIF. And then 3 weeks after that, Matt Colasar, the chief environmental scientist for Exxon, reached out to us. And he said to me, we think you have the answer that everybody's been looking for, and we want to trial it. So then, talk about pumping air back into your tires. That was a great call to receive. And then a month later, the Canadian consulate in the U.S. asked us to participate in a oil and gas clean tech challenge, which is hosted every year. It's a global competition, but hosted by the Colorado Clean Industries Association. And so we entered it. There's about 80 different new technologies that were shown, and it was evaluated by companies like Ovintiv, Chevron, Conoco, BP, Repsol, and we ended up in first place. So we had the rejection and then a win and then another win. We're going to trial now. So this takes us to the very beginning of 2023. After we won this award, got a call from the senior guys at Ovintiv saying, this is too good to be true, so we're going to find out why it isn't. And they did a really deep dive into the economics of it, the technology, safety, every aspect of it. And so was Exxon at the same time. So they started to trial in 2022. And after the first few weeks, they said, okay, this is what we want to do. Let's go commercial. At that same time, we had just won an award with Clean Resources Innovation Network, CRIN, which brought Cenovus to the table. And so we are now working with Exxon, Ovintiv, and Cenovus to develop the technology. And it was still early stage. But Exxon, they fast-tracked us in that we didn't go through procurement. We went through their lawyers in Houston, so it really accelerated things. They had us in the field in November 2022. We deployed 68 systems, 256 wells in 2 months. And then our first truck that Chart built for us entered into the area last year, January. And it was way more of a success than we ever thought. Like the truck got on lease and it was basically filling the tanks in 10 minutes and then turning and going off to the next. And so we had this cycle. We designed them so we filled them once a month. If they wanted a longer cycle, we put in a bigger tank, that kind of thing. Ovintiv did the exact same thing in Canada. They dealt with all of their biggest locations. So we did 40 locations, but they were like 42 well pads. And we now do all of their greenfield, which we've done across North America with so many now. But it all started last year with those 3 companies. But then since then, we've gone to full commercial operations with all of the biggest players: Chevron, Chesapeake, Southwestern, Pioneer, ConocoPhillips, BP, Repsol. Like, it's just what it is it's just so simple, and it's dumb hardware, right? It's just, you fill the tank up, it just vaporizes, liquid nitrogen turns to gas 700 times. So one tank does a lot of work for a month, and then we just roll on lease with these built for purpose trucks. And then we have 2,000 units operating, and we basically just got started with these guys. So yeah, that's kind of the story behind the company.
This podcast episode is sponsored by Connate Water Solutions. Do you need cost-effective water sourcing options to supply your next drilling or completions program? Connate Water Solutions is a specialized hydrogeology company focused on water well drilling, testing, and water management services in Western Canada and Texas. Contact info at connatewater.com or check out connatewater.com for more details. This episode is sponsored by Contango Commodity Marketing. Are you keen to learn more about the Western Canadian crude oil market? Contango Marketing is hosting a 2-day introductory course that provides comprehensive learning on logistical and commercial practices, practical insights into industry trends, and current market fundamentals. Spots are limited, so register now at contangomarketing.ca. The tanks are a physical asset which requires capital. How do you balance that with generating profits for the company, aka making money?
Our solution is a rental solution. And the reason why it is because there's no moving parts on these tanks. Well, there's two regulators and that's it, right? It's just laws of thermodynamics drives this. So the tanks are good for 20 years and then we depreciate them over 20 years and then they're recertified for another 20. So the rental model is better because you can spread the capital over a longer period of time to reduce the actual costs that an operator would need to pay. So Chart has financed everything for us. They finance all the tanks, loan to value. So it's like each tank has its own lease. Each truck has its own lease. They've been hugely supportive in that area. So the amount of equity we've raised is small. Like we've raised about $20 million, but we have an enterprise value of about 150 million right now, but Chart is a huge enabler. Because when you're setting up a business like this, you need to think about through, which I've learned from my experience in the industry, you need to set up your barriers to entry early, right? So Chart's the only manufacturer of cryogenic tanks in North America. We have an exclusive agreement with them, not only on supply, but on the financing of them. We have a patent pending on the technology, but I knew that the biggest barrier to entry was building out the distribution network. So we're operating in 6 major regions with a bunch of different sub-regions. We have the people in the trucks, and so nobody could really step into it and try to replicate what we do without bringing the customers at least 300 locations and the transports and tanks, which they're going to have to find offshore. So because it's a rental model, it's basically a prescription. So we cover our lease payments with the rental, and then we cover our distribution costs of nitrogen with these trucks, and the purchase of the liquid nitrogen. Liquid nitrogen is everywhere in the industry. So wherever oil and gas are, liquid nitrogen is. And so we have this infrastructure built out now to address all of this. So it's kind of like Ferris in the early days. In the first year, we built the largest cryogenic infrastructure for the energy industry in Canada in a year. But there we would move like 5,000 tons of nitrogen to a single location for these massive fracs. And here we move a very small number to 1,000 locations or 2,000 now. So it's a whole different model, but predicated on distribution of cryogenics. So we've been able to, I'm very careful about equity and who owns it. I know every single person who has shares in the company, mostly friends, family. The last round we did was a strategic one. And when guys think of strategic investment, they think of private equity or larger financial contributions, wealthy individuals and such. And Kemp Lewis, who is one of our shareholders and has helped support the company from the very start, he and I have had many conversations about, how to best address our capital needs with, keeping the shareholders in mind, value. But this last round, the strategic investors in my mind were those who were affected most by it. So went to the First Nations and in particular the Doig River First Nations and Halfway River First Nation, and talked to them about what we were doing. Spent a lot of time with Chief Trevor up in Fort St. John on their reserve at the nation. He loved it. And he said it gives us an opportunity to put our money where our mouth is. And he saw it as a very good way of having business reconciliation, to be able to be involved in the industry and supporting them the way the Doig River Nation always has supported the industry. And this in an environmental space. It's on their lands that we're trying to solve this problem. They're now common shareholders, those two nations, through their investment entities and with the Doig River First Nation through the nation itself. So they just doubled everything that their investment arm did. And they've been lovely to work with. So I'm really pleased with that. It's just getting started, going with them. But it exposes us to a lot of customers who work on their lands. And it's not like you're trying to force something on these operators. They have to comply in the next several years. They can see that it's benefiting the nations on the lands in which they're working. So I think that's a real positive for both the nation, the industry in general, and of course for Kathairos. I don't think the industry really has come to grips with what's going to be happening over the next few years. We've got mandates now to eliminate the methane from all these well sites on both sides of the border. The U.S. is going at it hard. Like I'd say 80% of our business is in the U.S. And they're all pulling from the same manufacturing supply chain. They will be, but there's over 500,000 locations. So this is not something you do in the last year before compliance is required. This is something companies need to be planning it out. Companies like Ovintiv have taken a very pragmatic project management, engineering approach to let's do the hardest ones first. We're going to go through our network as over the next several years to deploy and get the problem solved. Exxon was, let's do everything fast. Now they bought Pioneer, and Pioneer's got another 2,000 locations, so we'll probably work with them a lot to get those done fast. Chevron's been very pragmatic in basin by basin addressing it throughout the U.S., but I would implore these operators that they need to think about this. They need to think about how they're going to do it, when they're going to do it, and start working with the services industry in the tech world, whether it's us or Air Systems, all of this needs to be done. So let's put the plans together, right?
You worry that the producers will turn around and say, I want to do this on my own and that perhaps I don't need Kathairos. How do you make sure that they continue to use you guys?
I don't know how they would do it, right? Without breaking the barriers that I've set up. This is something that scale is important. Like when Exxon first started deploying in the Marcellus, they were anxious to hear about other operators who were adopting, not just for altruistic reasons from an industry perspective, but they knew that the scale would help bring down the nitrogen cost. So any one producer in any one area, you need all of the producers doing this to really get a cheap cost for the mitigation. So Ovintiv would talk to anybody about what we're doing. We have Continentals on lease with Exxon, in front of our tanks with the Exxon operators explaining it. It's like in this world where I came from a world where everything was secretive, in the energy industry. No one wanted to show anybody what they were doing. Technically here, they all share. They feel like it is an industry problem that we all need to address. So I don't worry about them doing it because it's not what they want to do anyway. It's a intensive, number of trucks. Like we've just been building trucks on a continuous basis, and Chart's been doubling their manufacturing capacity to be able to address this thing. We're doing a transaction with an incredibly large manufacturer that helps builds control systems for operators. And it's all that next level of operators, all the moms and pops throughout the US who need to have the solution too, right? So it's more of a cooperative approach in the industry, and we're an enabler. So I don't worry about somebody stepping in and trying to replicate this.
The critic would say, I want to do this. It's great for my business and the altruistic reasons to take care of the environment. But at the end of the day, my company needs to make money, and I'm not sure how this makes money for my business. Does the regulations the reason why companies, I guess, fall back on methane reduction, or how does that work?
You would think in Alberta, companies be falling over themselves trying to do this, other than just, we have several companies that we work with here in varying stages of scale. And a lot just starting to adopt now. So recognizing the task ahead of them. And in Canada, we're treated like we're still new technology, whereas in the US, they're ordering truckloads at a time, like 40 units per order. So in Alberta, there is a carbon offset credit program where for your largest emitting sites, you can generate enough carbon credits to cover all the costs. In 2030, when compliance is required, that will stop. But before then, you can take companies like Oventive who recognize this early and are generating a very large number of carbon credits, which help cover all their costs. And if you do the large locations first, it's an excess of costs, which helps you do the smaller locations. So what companies should be thinking, particularly the large ones like CNRL, and that think about the scale of this, right? Get it going, start doing hundreds of these. And if you're doing your largest ones first, they can use the carbon offsets directly, right? CNRL can. And then your biggest emissions are now providing you a revenue stream, which you can now address your lower emitting sites with. It just makes a lot of sense to me what we've done in Alberta, but it's the US that's on fire, right? Really going hard at it.
So the incentive is you get a carbon credit by reducing methane emissions for a company.
Yeah. And so when we stepped into this, we were trying to understand the whole serialization. It was always done through third parties, but we thought we have the best data in the industry. It's completely verifiable. So the verifiers that the government use love the data because it's direct connect. It's not like trying to measure cow farts or something, right? You know exactly what it is that you've mitigated. So it's a great environment for it. But now with regulations coming, it's going to be project management. It's got to be, how are we going to deal with this at scale? So one of the bigger issues are the stripper wells or the really small locations. We're just completing an application for the U.S. Department of Energy for a very, very large project along with CHART and the National Stripper Well Association and that to provide funding to put what I call these microvent tanks. So a very small liquid cryogenic tank on a location for these guys with a different kind of distribution network, smaller trucks. But now you can address what the EPA says are 550,000 locations of these marginal conventional wells really economically. So for like $170 a month, not much more than a cell phone cost charge, you can take your site to zero emissions. And we've got these new design tanks that are really small, but we only fill them up every couple months and they just sit on the lease. And like I say, the operators love it because they don't have to do anything. They don't have to think about it. It just works flawlessly.
What's the roadmap for Kathairos? Is the idea to grow the company and perhaps sell it one day, or just go public, just create a profitable private company? I don't know if you can talk about it, but where do you see the company going?
We have a huge job ahead of us, and as does the industry. You could look at the company and say 2,000 tanks is very successful already. I mean, we've won scale-up awards and different awards for recognition of how fast we're growing. But I think of the company in terms of by 2030, everything needs to be taken care of. So where within from today to 2030 do you provide the best value for your shareholders, whether it is a public issue, a sale, or how does that all look? So just to keep in our control, my view is you prepare it as if it goes public. I mean, it could do that early with some of these massive programs that we're doing in the US, but you prepare it so that you have all the controls in place, audited financials. Nice sideline is, our new controller is the daughter of my first business partner who had died so young. She was only 3 or 4 at the time. She was hired specifically to help us get the processes and systems in place to be able to take the company public with the governance and all the issues that we need to address to do that. And then we'll see what happens along the way. Our sole focus is delivering these systems and getting them in the field and supporting the industry and whatever they need with them.
Biggest challenge, and on the flip side, biggest opportunity for Kathairos?
Biggest challenge is messaging. It's right now, methane emissions is a C-suite issue, right? It gets pushed down to the facilities engineers to deal with, but it's a C-suite issue. The biggest challenge is getting the message out that we need to take a energy industry approach to this. By that, I mean a contemplative, scaled, sensible, project managed approach so that we can get all this done as an industry. We shouldn't sit back and wait to see if Trump changes things. That's not going to happen. In our industry, why would anybody want to reinstitute methane emissions? So it's here and it's going to happen. So the biggest challenge is getting the operators aligned with the understanding that this all can't be done in 1 year. It's got to be done over the next several years to get it done properly. The biggest opportunity is the exact same one, right? It is the opportunity to be able to support the industry and scaling with them to address the emissions. And we keep a counter in the office at the staff, and we have very young staff. I would say our staff are driven more by what we do than what they make. But we keep count of every hour we post how much CO2 emissions equivalent we've mitigated. And it's starting to become really large numbers, and our staff here are very proud of it, and so am I. This is my last go of a company, a startup. I've done several. This feels the best. It's meaningful from not just our industry perspective, but it's meaningful to shareholders like our First Nations shareholders, and it's meaningful to an environment, to our kids. So
you can make some money along the way also.
Yeah, exactly.
On the subject of starting businesses, you've had a few throughout the years. What advice would you give to a young entrepreneur or person in business in general?
I would give one piece of advice, and it goes back to 100 years ago. There was a guy, Napoleon Hill, who looked at a bunch of amazing entrepreneurs during the day, Andrew Carnegie and Henry Ford and that. And he said the one thing that every one of them had was a sense of definitiveness of purpose. And I cannot overstate that. When you start something, you have it in your head as to what you're going to bring out of the ether into creation, and you stick with it. Whether it's 5 years out, 5 months out, 5 days out, you focus hard on it, set it as a goal, and don't ever give up on it. And it'll come to fruition.
Well, that's an hour.
That was a fast hour.
I think we've covered the waterfront. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Trevor.
If somebody wanted to learn more about Kathairos and what you guys are up to, I think you're at the website.
Yeah, Kathairos, Kathairos.com. Kathairos is Greek for clean air. So yeah, we have a web page that you can check out. It's changing all the time. We've got a bunch of white papers in there that go through the technology and different things the operators are doing. We have some great videos of operators talking about their facilities and the challenges that they've had in the space and that. So because we have so many customers now, I think we have just about 60 MSAs with all the largest companies. We've become a bit of a fertile ground for sharing ideas and communications and such. So it's been an added benefit. So yeah, so check out the website and open up a conversation as to how you want to deal with these emissions that need to be addressed over the next few years.
Awesome. Well, we can end the formal conversation there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Trevor. It was great chatting with you.
Hello, listeners out there. Thanks for checking out the podcast. Hopefully the episode provided some insights. If you enjoyed the show, check out trose.ca where more episodes are yet to come. You can also subscribe to the podcast where your token of support is much appreciated. Until next time, happy coffee drinking.